Yeah. Does it look like everyone's here? It's 9 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. This roundtable is Future Directions in Correspondence and Archival Research. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Matt Poland. He's going to be presenting the Archives of English Studies. Matt Poland is a lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Washington and a research fellow at Marsh's Library in Dublin. He writes and teaches about transnational approaches to Victorian literature and the history of literary studies. His most recent publication is a co-edited special issue of Victorian Periodicals Review about race and transnationalism.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so I just clicked this, huh? How about that? Good morning. First, I want to thank Kristen, especially for being such a wonderful host, and I'm glad to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday in my talk, since we kind of finished up talking about the politics of collecting practices. And I'm a tinkerer with titles until the last minute, so this is the name of my talk now. It'll be different by the end. So let me start. It's been 10 years since the V21 Collective published its manifesto and shook up Victorian literary studies with its critique of positivist historicism and the fetishization of the archival, the desire to preserve the Victorian period wie es eigentlich gewesen, their German, not mine, as it actually was, and their attendant claims in favor of strategic presentism, that is to say, an awareness that our interest in the period is motivated by certain features of our own moment. I think the field has largely ingested V21's valuable points, but as an archival scholar, I'm still preoccupied by this tension between the archival and strategic presentism. I share their aims to dismantle ongoing Victorian processes of capital and empire in my writing and teaching. But what could be more antiquarian than doing what I do, which is, to paraphrase Anne yesterday, reading the mail of in my case, canonical Victorian writers, even worse. I would suggest that returning to the archives of Victorian studies itself, to the institutional collecting practices that shape our access to correspondence, that is, correspondence about correspondence, has important implications. First, for really grappling with the non-objectivity and contingency of historical source material, and second, for reimagining our knowledge production under the ongoing material and epistemic crises of neoliberalism. To do so, I have a short case study about the Forster collection at the National Art Library, which is housed at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the surprising ways that this trove of Charles Dickens's manuscripts and letters were shaped directly by imperialism. So, to start the story properly, Dickens was dead to begin with. Thank you. And he willed his papers to John Forster, the inveterate London literary man who was also Dickens's biographer and executor of his estate. Forster was a prominent booster of the South Kensington Museum, the new South Kensington Museum, which was designed to represent nation and empire in the same space, to be, in the words of its second director, a material symbol of advance in the march of civilization, befitting the greatest commercial and colonizing empire of the world. So Forster bequested his enormous library and manuscript collections to be publicly available to readers at the South Kensington Museum on his death in 1876. It's an incredible archive. He corresponded with nearly every Victorian cultural figure you've ever heard of. And it's been a crucial resource for Dickens scholars and editors, and many scholars of other stripes as well. It has 6 of Dickens' novel manuscripts, including the one for Bleak House here, which when I held it, I cried. But public access to private correspondence was to prove a tricky issue for Forster's own executors. The Reverend Whitwell Elwyn, who was the one-time editor of the Quarterly Review, the judge, Sir Joseph Chitty, and the person my story focuses on, Robert Lytton, the poet and diplomat who was appointed Viceroy of India shortly after Forster's death. Lord Lytton, as you know, I'm sure, oversaw the proclamation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India and the Delhi Durbar, as well as the bloody Pyrrhic victory of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which forced his own resignation and that of Disraeli's government. And just to do a little bit of credit to the poet side of his persona. This is a kind of bad picture I took yesterday upstairs of the Browning's own copy of his verse novel Lucille from 1860 under his pen name. This leads me to 1886, when curators wanted to begin cataloging the letters to publish a public index, as they'd done with the books already. This raised alarm bells for Eliza Ann Forster, John's protective widow. So on March 20th, Lord Lytton wrote to Sir Joseph Chitty, quote, "He left, as you know, all his manuscripts to the South Kensington Museum. Amongst those of later date are letters addressed to him by many of his literary contemporaries. Some of these Mrs. Forster has asked me to read through with a view to ascertaining whether there is anything in them of a nature too private and personal to be deposited at the museum." Lytton and Elwyn were worried about copyright as well as privacy. That is whether public availability of the papers at the museum constituted publication and put them at risk of litigation, which, as we were talking about yesterday, that the UK copyright law is kind of an ongoing problem with correspondence, unpublished correspondence. But as Lytton coordinated with curators and delegated legal questions to the judge, it seems to have been the principle of the thing that really bothered him. So this is a later letter. He said, "I know that if I were to receive such an application respecting private letters written by any relative of my own, I should not only decline to sanction their deposit in a public museum, but I should also request the owners of them to restore them to the family of their writer." There you have it. Faced with a complicated issue and under pressure to resolve it before traveling abroad, Lytton did what I would do. He spiraled. Letters flew, and Lytton seemingly decided the legal issue for himself by concluding in another letter that the museum cannot expect that we should consent to their publication. So on April 4th, by the Morning Post, Lytton implored Chitty for 10 minutes talk while he was in town for the day about the Forster letters, about which I am much puzzled. Then, by Evening Post, all was well. Well, Mrs. Forster has sent me the letters intended for Mr. Phelps, the curator. I agree with you that there is nothing in any of them to the publication of which we need object. In the end, it was not a question of law, but of content and secure reputations that made the correspondence suitable for this repository of national cultural heritage, as far as Lytton was concerned. So, even though the executors of Forster's estate didn't censor the correspondence in this instance, Lord Lytton's letters preserve and expand the moment where it transformed from ad hoc communication to archival record. They also preserve Lytton's powerful instinct to close ranks, to instrumentalize the law, and to bring the paranoia of a career diplomat and colonial administrator to bear on the disclosure of information about literary history, his desire to compose a fiction of control. Victorian imperialism and knowledge institutions are usually conceptualized as moving in lockstep. But contra this Foucauldian account of the Victorian Museum as heterotopia, the fantasy of all knowledge collected and united in the service of state and empire, systematized and exhibited at the London Museum devoted to fostering national and imperial culture together, here we have the inclinations of empire tugging national cultural knowledge out of shape. The material in archives is remediated by its institutional housing. Archives do not just store and supply evidence. They are embedded in social worlds and networked to other forms of cultural production across different geographical and temporal boundaries. Latent connections to empire in hearing and scholarly source material reveal our discipline's own implication in structural asymmetries of power. Nasser Mufti has recently drawn attention to early American Victorian studies in the 1950s and its silence on then-going decolonization around the world, pointing to, and I'm quoting from Nasser here, how 19th century British literary studies was invented not in repressive blindness, but in a kind of negative relation, the fact of decolonization. These dynamics shape the literary archive. And finally, we can also use our knowledge of their messy imbrication in systems of power to shape the future of the discipline and the university. Just a small claim. I really don't think V21 went far enough in this respect. I think they were too parochial. In her wonderful book from a couple years ago, Dirty Knowledge, Julia Schleck argues persuasively that the regime of academic freedom, now under threat from all sides, was premised in the early 20th century on liberal notions of pure, politically neutral knowledge, collected in the service of the state and the public good, with an equal distribution of material resources across the disciplines. Obviously, that's not the world we live in anymore. And what's more, we were never actually disinterested anyway. Re-emphasizing the university as a forum for contending views of the social good, including the diverse forms of knowledge that do not add to the material wealth of the capitalist university, should begin with a liberating acknowledgement of the dirtiness of knowledge that has always been shot through with the politics and iniquities that characterize our society at large. I don't think this is news to scholars who read 19th century mail, but renewed attention to how that mail was delivered to us puts us in a stronger position to articulate what real material good our scholarship creates. Correspondence, a wonderfully messy form of dirty knowledge, can, to paraphrase Dracula, bring 19th century British literary studies up to date with a vengeance. Thank you very much.
You, Matt, and I apologize for not having your presentation correct. Next up, we have.
Tell you.
Did I miss the memo? Our next speaker is Martha Groppo, and her presentation, This is Private, Personal Correspondence, Public Work, and the Imperial Networks of Aristocratic Women. Martha is an assistant professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University. Her book project, Voices Crying in the Wilderness, Aristocratic Women, Imperial Networks, and Rural Healthcare, 1879 to 1939, uses a correspondence of nurses, colonial officials, and aristocratic women to examine a network of rural nursing associations that extended across British world in the late 19th to 20th centuries. Her research has been supported by fellowships at the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, Princeton University Center for Human Values, Barbara Bates Center for the History of Nursing, and the Consortium for the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and just thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just delighted to be here, and I feel a little extra special, I think, since I think I'm the only historian. So I hope that the rest of you will still find something of interest in my interest in the history of rural healthcare, the challenges it presents and the inequalities it highlights, has led me from frozen outports in Newfoundland to the red heart of Australia and beyond. I'm interested in pushing back against characterizations of rural places and people as being backward and isolated by incorporating them into wider imperial and world histories. I also explore some of the many ways that efforts to address poor rural health have historically failed, contributing to inequalities that have only deepened as medical care has become more technologically driven, centralized, and expensive. The book project that I've been working on for about a decade now, and this network is, I'm not advancing. Am I moving the volume here?
Pointed it at the screen.
Sorry about that. Here, can I? That's okay. It's a very underwhelming network compared to Anne's yesterday. It's just for your visual evaluation.
Okay.
No worries. I'll just soldier on.
There we go.
Okay.
We're scrolling again, sorry. So just use the mouse.
Use the mouse. Okay.
So scroll down with the trackpad here. I guess.
Okay. All right. Oh no, my font didn't come over right well. Oh, that's okay. That's all right. This will just give you something to look at. Rural nursing associations that stretched across the British Empire from the 1880s to the 1930s. And it relies on over 30 archival collections and counting. But it's often been correspondence of nurses, patients, and especially of the aristocratic women who organized and financially supported their healthcare options that has charted my path across the world as I reconstruct this network. As a young grad student, I noticed striking similarities between a series of similar rural nursing associations that began to spring up across the British world from the late 19th century. They were located in Australia, Newfoundland, South Africa, Canada, the United Kingdom, all the different component parts, India, New Zealand, and bizarrely later to Appalachia. All employed British nurses who traveled to rural patients, providing them with in-home nursing and midwifery care, rather than expecting their patients to travel to a distant hospital. Others had noticed these similarities, and some had even theorized that the organizations were related to each other in some way. But existing studies had been written using the institutional archives of now largely defunct associations. The result was detailed studies of isolated associations. While examining these institutional histories and archives, I noticed that in every case, an aristocratic woman, usually the wife of a colonial governor or viceroy, had been involved with the Rural Nursing Association at its origins. Further investigation of these women helped me realize that these same women were also integral to the history of rural nursing within the United Kingdom. Aristocratic women had not been of much interest to nursing or medical historians for the simple reason they're not trained healthcare professionals. They were philanthropic amateurs who nevertheless meddled in and often funded rural nursing associations. Their archives have also, I think, been under-examined by historians of imperialism and colonial governance. It was only when I turned to correspondence recovered from colonial records offices and private aristocratic collections that I realized how deeply invested many aristocratic women and colonial wives were in the mechanics of rural nursing. Through examining their correspondence, a complex trans-imperial network of ideas and influence, oh no, my font again, began to emerge. Aristocratic women who became proconsular wives were in active communication with each other about their rural nursing schemes. Taking a healthcare model used widely at home in the United Kingdom to their often remote estates and attempting it in one colony after another, also applying what they learned to their management of nursing associations at home in between and after colonial appointments. Through their correspondence and imperial migrations, they not only connected metropole and colony, but also rural periphery to rural periphery. I use this truth to suggest that while these rural nursing associations targeted the medical ramifications of geographical isolation, they were not created or sustained in isolation from each other, but belonged to a wider imperial network of ideas, nurses, and patronesses. To a significant degree, this network relied upon private connections and communications. Take, for example, a 1906 letter written by Lady Antrim to her sister, Lady Minto, a founder of a nursing association for rural India. The letter describes Lady Antrim's recent efforts to drum up support for her sister's Lady Minto Indian Nursing Association at a tea time chat that took place in the Irish countryside. Lady Antrim had described her sister's new association to Lady Dufferin, a former vicereine who managed nursing associations in both India and Ireland at the time. I am thrilled over your nursing scheme and feel sure it will be a success and a source of untold comfort to hundreds. Lady Dufferin was so much interested. She understands every nuance so well. She had just had such an interesting letter from a nurse or superintendent, I forget which, from Northern India, I think. And though it is marked private, she will, I hope, send it to you. It gives such well-described details of her work and the difficulties that she meets. Here is a clear record of elite women sharing ideas and connections in an exchange that stretched from rural Ireland to an Indian outpost. The only record of this conversation exists in the private correspondence between two sisters, not in the public-facing files of the minutes and reports of the Lady Minto Indian Nursing Association. But I think the history of this association is incomplete without the use of dozens of similar letters. Correspondence was often also the key to seeing how aristocratic women supported each other in philanthropic matters, but it's also key in understanding how they disagreed. Names that appear in supportive solidarity as the members of a nursing association's organizing committee sometimes fracture into competing factions that are championing different approaches when you look at correspondence. As an example, consider a letter written by Lady Dufferin to her daughter in Scotland after she attended a meeting regarding an Irish Rural Nursing Association that was run by the wife of the Viceroy of Ireland at the time, Lady Aberdeen. I went to Lady Aberdeen's health meeting. It lasted from 2 until 5:30, and her president's address was most tiresome. It seemed as it would never come. Too long for a meeting. Afterward, we were more lively over her proposal to have cheap nurses for Ireland. I am not so much against them as some people, but I thought she had settled it out of court and merely expected us to ratify her arrangements. So I helped oppose, and we got it referred back to subcommittee. The record of this meeting that appears in the association's minutes is quite different and far less contentious. Correspondence can also be useful for illuminating what colonial wives thought about rural people and places they championed through their philanthropy. Like many proconsular women, Lady Margaret Stanley was glowing in her public statements about the awe-inspiring frontiers and hardy Australian people she encountered during her time in Australia. An account given of her visit to a rural town to visit an Australian bush nurse in a letter to her mother was far less filtered, describing the sanitary arrangements as, quote, indescribable. Stanley described her despair when, after 3 days of restraint, she consigned herself to using the local latrine, only to be told that it was frequented by tiger snakes. Said, so I chose to run the risk of dying of constipation and of a snake bite on the blank. Another letter to her mother, she described her secret views of the Australians in Melbourne that she courted for support of her various nursing efforts. We had our garden party here yesterday, a boring and tedious little event. Adelaide brought me to shame in the middle of it by shrieking out at the top of her voice, I don't think this is a dull party, do you, Mummy? I replied that I hoped everyone was enjoying it, whereupon she said, oh, but you thought it was going to be so dull. Mercifully for Lady Stanley, this exchange with her child was not included in newspaper coverage. In other cases, one aristocratic woman's archive has been able to help me fill in gaps and silences in another's. In an extreme example of this, it's the case of Rachel, the Countess of Dudley, a woman who established 2 different major rural nursing services, but who ordered her archive burned after her death. Fortunately, Indian Viceroy George Curzon was far less stringent in his editorship of his wife's archival legacy, and he kept 43 volumes of Mary Curzon's correspondence after her untimely death at the age of 34. You cannot burn the letters you mailed, and one of the Countess of Dudley's letters survives in Mary Curzon's archive. I follow most faithfully every mention of you in all your movements, Dudley wrote to Curzon, helping me verify that she was undoubtedly aware of Curzon's nursing work in India, work that had previously not been connected to Dudley's strikingly similar work in Ireland or Australia. Dudley then went on to describe her recovery from a near-fatal miscarriage, helping me explain a period where she inexplicably disappeared from nursing association archives. I've been in bed for 5 long months. It's all over now and it feels like a bad dream, but I can never tell you what this year has been. I mind all these wasted, useless months, and I cannot forget the disappointment of losing my poor baby. Letters like this one have brought home to me the importance of reading public-facing sources alongside private correspondence. Public philanthropy could be deeply personal to the women I study, and even national associations, charities, and events could be profoundly impacted by private decisions, opinions, and crises. There's more I could say about the many letters written by nurses and patients that are also part of my research, but I've been asked to just close with reflecting briefly on future directions. And I don't know how typical my experience or future directions are amongst junior historian scholars, but the kind of transnational project I was able to undertake became impossible for several years due to pandemic shutdowns and travel restrictions right after I completed my research. Also, an archival project of this scale would have been impossible without many research fellowships and open-minded advisors who supported what at times must have felt like absurd ambition. Those of you who are engaged in digitization projects, research fellowship schemes, and meaningful mentorship of young scholars are integral in making these kinds of projects possible. I do think my own research experiences have pointed to the benefit of viewing the correspondence of multiple correspondence in one frame. I've learned so much from reading so much, putting public and private archives side by side, and I realize that's not a neat boundary at all. To reveal a story about empire, patronage, philanthropy, and trans-imperial idea exchange. I view each letter as a thread that helps me weave a complex network of correspondence, one that allows me to connect places and people that have too often been examined in isolation. Digitization and increasingly detailed search engines, library guides, and collection indices have made it more possible than ever before to follow multiple correspondence. Archives are always incomplete, idiosyncratic, and imperfect, but viewing them together can, I think, help me come closer to comprehending a true culture of correspondence. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Danae Dick, and she is presenting Inspiration is Dialogue, the Making of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's A Drama of Exile. Danae is an assistant professor of English at Texas State University. Her research and teaching interests include 19th century British literature and culture, women's writing, poetry, and religion, spirituality. She is the author of Biblical Wisdom and the Victorian Literary Imagination, and her articles have appeared in journals such as Victorian Poetry, Victorian Popular Fictions Journal, and the Victorian Review. She was previously a visiting scholar with us here at the ABL, so we're very excited to welcome her back to speak today.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's lovely to be back. And I'd like to join my fellow panelists in thanking Kristen Pond and the organizers of the symposium for inviting me and putting together such a fabulous event. With the publication of her widely reviewed volume Poems in 1844, Elizabeth Barrett Moulton Barrett, later Elizabeth Browning, and hereafter EBB, the initials used as her poetic signature both before and after her marriage, became one of England's most prominent female poets. But the road to fame was not an easy one. EBB's epic ambition is nowhere more apparent than in this collection's lead work, a masque-like reinterpretation of humankind's expulsion from Eden, beginning where John Milton's Paradise Lost concludes. She meditates on what we might call the fallout of the fall in a poetic dialogue that assembles the voices of Adam, Eve, Lucifer, Gabriel, Christ, and the spirits of the earth. In a letter to her scholarly mentor, Hugh Stuart Boyd, EBB recounted that after her initial exultation and boldness in conceiving this piece, she fell into despair. "Never was a manuscript so near the fire as my masque was," she said. Fortunately for EBB, her cousin John Kenyon, an established writer and patron of the arts, rescued the manuscript, promising to provide his honest opinion. And while he offered various criticisms, his assurance of overall excellence sustained EBB throughout the poem's revision and publication. Such anecdotes are discoverable thanks to the Browning's Correspondence, a project begun by Philip Kelly and Ronald Hudson. Scott Lewis, Edward Hagan, and Linda M. Lewis have continued this project with 30 volumes to date, as well as digital transcriptions. And yet, there is more to the story, and the symposium has been fabulous in highlighting the material, interpretive, and political questions that attend reading letters. I had the great good fortune to work with the physical copies of Kenyon's Correspondence, as well as other archival holdings here at the Armstrong Browning Library as a visiting scholar 7 years ago, and it's so wonderful to be back. Recent work by Marjorie Stone and Kirsty Blair has underscored the value of archival work in unfolding EBB's poetic practices, as well as rethinking models of composition at large. In the particular case of A Drama of Exile, this work invites a rethinking of both authorship and inspiration. The poet herself sometimes described her creative activity in terms reminiscent of romantic concepts of original individual genius, as in letters to Boyd about both this poem and A Drama and The Cry of the Children. However, other epistolary exchanges suggest a more collaborative, incremental process. The Armstrong Browning Library holds 2 letters from Kenyon pertaining to A Drama of Exile, as well as portions of the autograph manuscript. And as we heard about the other day, the Browning Letters Project is now making these letters and manuscripts available online. Even as Kenyon expresses his admiration, he questions EBB's archaisms and makes substantial suggestions regarding characterization. Why do you, who taught me to say between, say betwixt? Later reiterating, betwixt? Have you come to prefer that word? The answer would appear to be yes, as EBB retained this language, though she did take up other editorial recommendations, such as retaining the accent in the word orbed and the capitalization of God during a speech by Lucifer. A more substantial critique emerges in Kenyon's objection to Lucifer's line, "I swoon from the perception," to describe his enduring sensitivity to beauty. Kenyon states, "This strikes me as exaggerated and not very full of distress. Besides which, there is something of effeminacy in that glorious darkness, the prodigy of the vast brows swooning. Women swoon, not this, to this." Interesting gendered language there. And she did. The lines in the published text portray Lucifer with significant dignity and gravitas. Lucifer's role in A Drama of Exile reflects EBB's romantic revisionism, as well as her broader reframing of fallenness. Even as she figures Lucifer as tragically mistaken, she offers a sympathetic representation of him as the former morning star. For her part, EBB thanked Kenyon, going so far as to say of the 2-volume poems, and this is a quote, "Isn't it our book?" Kenyon likewise uses the first-person plural, underscoring the importance of their consultation about a work that EBB continued to revise for its republication in subsequent collections throughout the 1850s. The autograph manuscript of A Drama of Exile further shows the gradual refinement of her vision, containing 2 variants of the initial conversation between Adam and Eve that display the poet's labored, nuanced engagement with patriarchal exegesis. In what appears to be the second draft, Eve follows her self-abasing statements with the confident assertion, "Since I was the first in the transgression, with my little foot, I will be the first to tread from this sword glare into the outer darkness of this waste." A marginal note from EBB herself reads, "I do not like little. It is almost coquettish. With my firm foot." The line in the published text reads, "with a steady foot," emphasizing Eve's strength. Countering misogynistic interpretations while still reworking inherited traditions, EBB renders Eve both penitential and insightful. Dialogue occupies a crucial place within her poetic imagination, as Karen Dielman has shown in her analysis of EBB's literary adaptation of modes derived from Congregationalist preaching. This understanding can be taken further by considering the hermeneutic context informing her poetics. EBB's creative reinterpretation took shape against the backdrop of developments in biblical higher criticism that challenged accepted ideas about canonical texts, emphasizing their diverse historical contexts, composite authorship, and literary qualities. Rather than presuppose a special revelatory status, the higher critics studied the Bible like any other book, as Benjamin Jowett memorably summarized it. A Drama of Exile displays EBB's reverent and artistically innovative adaptation of biblical poetry's parallelism, brought into sharper relief in studies by Robert Louth and Johann Gottfried Herder. Beyond the opening chapters of Genesis, her poem distinctly echoes the divine speeches in the book of Job, which likewise employs the dramatic poem to engage with radically different moral imaginations about the nature of the cosmos and the meaning of suffering. As I argue in my recent book, A Drama of Exile participates in a broader trend, the creative refashioning of biblical wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Gospel parables, in response to higher critical debates. At a time when inspiration became a hotly contested theological idea, wisdom literature, a genre driven by questioning and dialogue, provided Victorian writers of a variety of belief or unbelief positions with a means of reframing revelation in relation to the reader's active engagement. My study aims to contribute to post-secular scholarship that troubles a reductive faith-doubt dichotomy, as well as to post-critical endeavors to find alternatives to reading practices that are narrowly focused on distance and detachment. And while the chapter on EBB was the only one informed by an archival research trip, having this experience early in the process made me much more attuned to correspondence as a crucial facet of my study of each author. The Olive Schreiner letters online, for instance, became particularly useful to me. And what these Victorian reimaginations of wisdom literature have in common, I argue, is their commitment to dialogue. Friedrich Schleiermacher called attention to this form as a crucial means of catalyzing the search for meaning in his Introduction to the Dialogues of Plato, which EBB herself acquired sometime after her marriage to Robert Browning in 1846. Marginal pencil strokes in this book, also held at the ABL, underscore passages about seeking wisdom as a quest that begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance. Schleiermacher conceptualizes dialogue as arising from awareness of limited knowledge, an idea further developed by Hans-Georg Gadamer in Truth and Method. As Schleiermacher and Gadamer remind us, interpretation requires more than grasping accurate information. It is a transformative process. And engaging in archival work in pursuit of this transformation helps to ensure that our own hermeneutic approaches do not become overly abstracted, remaining sensitive to material and embodied practices. The Making of a Drama of Exile provides a thought-provoking example of what inspiration as dialogue might look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Janae. Next, we're very happy to welcome Allison Reising back as well. Allie's an independent scholar who recently completed her PhD here at Baylor University. Her research is on classical reception in the 19th century, and her articles have appeared in Victorian Poetry and Eudora Welty Review. She curated the archival exhibition Puppy Love, an exploration of Victorian pet owner relationships, which was on display here at the Armstrong Browning Library in spring 2022.
Hi, everyone.
Just a second.
For Riley for wrangling all these PowerPoint. We should also point out that Allie curated the current exhibit, so yeah, it's up. So Riley installed it, but Allie designed it. So you should go up and see. It's about like women and nature and pulls together some things that are here at the ABL.
Okay, Allie, you're gonna
Scroll.
have to scroll. Yeah, sorry about that.
I'll provoke.
Yes, this is to ponder. So the piece of the project I'm going to share with you today is a little part of my dissertation, which is now my book project, which is on the Browning's classical scholarship. So following Danae, just adding Robert into the mix. Much of the key work on this project I did here at the ABL, and it wouldn't be the project that it is without the resources here and the awesome librarians here. So thank you so much. So in the section I'm presenting today, I'm going to be focusing on how the Brownings' reading and their translations of Homer get translated into the language of their courtship and their correspondence. So my project, I thought of as an archival project, a manuscript project, an annotations project. So I was spending a lot of time with individual volumes of Homer that the Brownings owned that are held here. I was paying close attention to their notes, to the marginalia that they were leaving in those books. But as the project grew and developed, I realized that it was really the correspondence that was giving life to the project and helping me make meaning of the markings. Without that correspondence, there wouldn't be the same story to tell about what the Brownings were doing. So looking into the correspondence helped me realize that the process through which Robert and EBB got to know each other operated through shared scholarly practices and discoveries often. So sometimes this would take the form of alluding to a classical text and then often recurring to it and kind of amplifying it across time. So because of EBB's chronic illness, much of this took place by mail. Robert's first letter to her in January of 1845 famously announced, "I love your verses with all my heart, dear Miss Barrett, and I love you too." ABB initially deflected this declaration. And while she was clearly eager to continue the correspondence, she was quite hesitant to meet. And they wouldn't meet in person for another 4 months after this, in May of 1845. So in their correspondence, which stretched over the next year and 18 months, leading to their marriage, poetry, yes, obviously, but also classical scholarship provided them with ample subject matter for discussion. Both of them were amateur translators of Greek. Both had read Homer at very young ages. And so Homer offered a sort of common ground for working out what their relationship might look like. In the early correspondence, Robert often tended to employ classical allusion as a way of navigating awkwardness, which I love, and his uncertainty about their developing relationship. So in early May of 1845, he was clearly feeling bashful about how often he'd been writing to Edie. He uses an allusion to the opening of the Iliad to make fun of himself. So he says, "For some reason that looked like an instinct, I thought I ought not to send shaft on shaft, letter plague on letter, with such an uninterrupted clanging, that I ought to wait, say, a week at least, having killed all your mules for you, before I shot down your dogs. But not being exactly Phoebus Apollon, you're to know further that when I did think I might go modestly on," oh boy, getting in the Greek there. "Alas, let me get out of this slough of a simile, never mind with what dislocation of ankles." When I read this, I was like, what is he talking about? So, like Apollo, shooting his arrows into the camp of the Greeks to punish them for insulting his priest, this is in book 1 of the Iliad, Robert imagines himself as Apollo, overwhelming EBB with a volley of letters. So he goes on a little further down in the letter to self-consciously admit that he's using what he calls talk about books to confess his intimidation about writing to her at all. So at this point, they still hadn't met, but a meeting had been floated. And I think at the increasingly likely prospect of their friendship jumping off the pages of their correspondence and actually manifesting itself in a face-to-face encounter, he was getting anxious. So their planned first meeting was postponed because Robert was ill. And EBB reached out with a letter, and this time she brings up Homer, and she recalls his same allusion with an inquiry into his health. She says, "And now, if you've done killing the mules and the dogs, let me have a straight, quick arrow for myself, if you please. Just a word to say how you are." Her response here, I found delightful. It's so playful, it's personal, it's disarming. It's kind of meeting him on his own terms. And it's converting Apollo's shafts of death into those desired darts of love. She's like, send as many letters as you want. I'm happy to receive them. And the two would meet 9 days after this letter on May 20th, 1845. So, although this tiny shared joke about Robert killing the mules and the dogs seems kind of like just a passing fancy, I found that revisiting this text actually became a way of memorializing and reflecting back on their relationship over time. So in late March of the following year, at this point, EBB has confessed her love for Robert in return. He again brings up his joke about Apollo's arrows, but this time in the context of a project she was currently working on. And this project included some short translations from Homer. Okay, so she tells him about these current translations, but then that reminds her of another translation project that she was working on the year prior. So she confides in him this story. About a year ago, the time they were writing their first few letters, when I had a sudden fit of translating, I made an experiment on the first 50 lines of the Iliad. Listen to what I remember. And as you can see, you skim through this translation she copied down. Notice the passage she's translating. It's the same Apollo's arrows passage that Robert was describing. So then she continues. And so we get to the arrows you talked of. Ah, do you remember? Do you remember? Which were to kill my dogs and mules, you said, but they didn't. I have an enchanted dog, which nobody can deny, and I'm not far to seek in my Apollo. So, BB is sharing something really intimate here, I think. This sudden fit of translating of the Apollo's Arrows passage was coinciding, obviously, with Robert's allusion. And I think it's interesting that now she's ready to confess, I actually spent time translating this passage you talked to me about. So I think it's fun to see how their growing intimacy at this point is reflected in her growing transparency about her scholarship and how it connects to her personal life. Now, EBB is comfortable explicitly casting Robert as my Apollo, and her dog Flesh as that enchanted dog, which I have to make a digression here. This reading Apollo as the enchanted dog, or sorry, Flesh as the enchanted dog, is particularly funny, given that when Robert first visited, Flesh considered him a competitor for EBB's affections and bit him in the leg. So the story just goes on. But stepping back to the bigger picture, I think EBB's letter reveals that she's still mulling over the full significance of the Homeric allusion for them and still thinking about how their story enacts it, yes, translates it, but also embellishes it, amplifies it, takes it in new directions, which is really interesting to me. So thinking about how these shaped my understanding of my project, these passages, although small, were really formative because here I was seeing how authorship for each of the Brownings and scholarship for each of the Brownings is shaped by these moments of shared scholarly, ultimately I called it play. Through their correspondence, they're reading alongside one another and sort of even annotating possibly alongside one another before they ever meet in person. So moving into the project, when I was turning back to their marginalia in their books or to manuscripts of their translations, I'm paying really close attention to the ways that those personal influences might be shaping their scholarly interests and practices. So I think ultimately my takeaway from this whole project has been, even the criticism that we're doing requires a lot of creativity, and bringing in correspondence helped me to imaginatively fill out the story and see the Brownings in a much more holistic and interesting way. Thanks.
Thank you all. If y'all want to come up here for the roundtable, and we'll begin taking. Questions, anyone?
There is a question from the audience. This is a question for Martha from Linda Maria Grasso. She says, thank you for your fascinating work. My question, do you have any trace in any form of the women who were served by the nursing associations? In general, how do you deal with a one-sided story, historical stories?
So I think that's the beauty of looking at both this private correspondence alongside the association archives, because they do have quite a few letters from patients. Also, the aristocratic women talk about their interactions with would-be patients during their travels, but there are quite a few letters from patients. It's also problematic though, because usually they're writing to the association because they have a problem or they have a really good experience. And so I don't think it's a fully, most of these are sort of frontier settler women. Or in the case of India, women connected to the military in some way, sort of incorporated wives who are there because of what their husbands are doing. And so I do think it's there and I use them. This was just focused more on this network. But it's still interesting when we're talking about letters, how sort of incomplete it is. There's a lot of complaints, and I don't know if I should take from that these schemes are always unappreciated, and often they are, but I don't want to overemphasize that because for some people, it's also life-saving. So I'm still trying to figure out how to use some of those letters, to be frank. And nurses, there's a lot of nurses letters too. And there's a whole sort of network of nursing letters as well. Thank you for the question.
In the back, is it Susan?
Mara.
Mara.
So this is also for Martha again. What a wonderful talk. What a great morning this has been. I believe you mentioned, unless I misheard, that one of these rural associations was in Appalachia. Can you say a little bit more about that? It's fascinating to me.
It's so strange. So again, when you follow the network, you follow the people. And so one of the places, a very similarly structured association that still employs British nurses ends up is in rural Kentucky, so my home state. And I think it has a lot to do with the perceived racial similarities in this sort of eugenic environment. That's a later association, and it really gets off the ground in the post-World War I era. And that kind of rhetoric about eugenic breeding of a better Anglo race is really prominent. And I think they see similarities with women and other patients in other parts of the so-called Anglo world at that time. But it's bizarre, yeah. And so the patroness there is not an aristocrat from a landed British family, but she does meet those folks during World War I and stay with them in London. And then she's from a very elite Southern family. The Breckinridge family are quite prominent in, some of you might be aware of them in sort of Southern history.
Okay, this is still percolating in my mind. So I've been grappling with something that Anne talked about yesterday about letters as a literary genre. And so this makes me think, Matthew, of your paper, and Allie, also something that I know about from your dissertation. So Matthew, you were talking about kind of these editorial practices of trying to decide what gets included, what gets excluded, and that there seems to be something that they want to editorialize letters. And yet at the same time, things that are coming in through translation, we can see tons of texts, 18th century, 19th century, this has been censored, or we've removed sensitive information from this. And there seems to be absolutely no problem in doing that with someone else's work. If it's perceived as literary, or if it's a travel log or something like that, but suddenly it's letters. So I'm wondering about this idea of putting letters in different categories and kind of the ethical implications of that. And I think that ties in somewhat, Allie, with things about EBB and Robert, but especially EBB and her critiques of other translators that she saw as incomplete in their translations, particularly of classical literature. So I know that's a lot and slightly discombobulated, but it's editorial practices, the ethics of editorializing letters, and thinking about, does that come back to a question of genre?
Well, I think you should start.
Yeah, no, well, I have two correspondingly disconnected thoughts, which is the thing that really interests me about these letters from Lord Lytton and kind of circulating with the three executors, is that it's not even editorial. It's pre-editorial, right? It's shaping in the like dissertation version of this. I call it the prehistory of scholarly reception. So what's interesting to me in this project, and one that I've done about Eliot's letters at the Beinecke, is this sense of what is being shaped by actors before we scholars can get our grubby hands on them, right? That like before even someone like, I'm blanking on the editors of Dickens's letters right now, Humphrey House maybe, but or Gordon Haight in the example of George Eliot. Before they can even get to it. So that doesn't answer the genre question, which is something that I've kind of been mulling over too. And I've lost my second disconnected thought. I'll let you carry on.
Equally disconnected comments. So I'm trying to think, I'm sure that this comes in many ways in translations, but actually I have an interesting anecdote. So it involves correspondence, but correspondence kind of getting dragged onto the pages of a newspaper. So when Elizabeth died, when EBB died, Edward Fitzgerald, who I'm sure you are familiar with, he was an Orientalist, I believe. He wrote in a letter, "Thank goodness Mrs. Browning is dead. Now we'll have no more Aurora Lees." And something to that effect. And so time went by, and I think around 1880, his letters were published posthumously. Robert read the letters. And I mean, they were not censored, obviously. That comment was not taken out. And he was so offended that he wrote a poem, and he wrote to someone in a periodical, I don't remember which periodical, but he wrote a poem to Edward Fitzgerald, who was also dead now. And the poem was something short like, "I happened upon your letter and blah, blah, blah. If you were still here, your face would be dignified by me spitting on it." So it was, and then he tried to recall that poem. I think he addressed it to him by name. There was no anonymity about it, really. And everyone else had read the letters. They all knew who he was talking about. So he regretted it, but he kind of helped Edward Fitzgerald drag EBB's name through the mud by pulling that correspondence onto the page of the public periodical. Yeah. So not super related to translation, but the genres were just definitely getting mixed in messy ways.
Next question.
I really like the fact that you brought up that V21 manifesto, right? And that tension between the sort of historicist and presentist. I wonder, do you think where we are now that we might look at this differently, right? And I'm sort of thinking about the assaults on history, right, that are happening right now, right? Where certain kinds of history, where, you know, universities in Florida are being told that they cannot teach those things anymore. So do we see the sort of the politics of the historicist and the presentist in a different way, right, than we did sort of 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think yes, I like we have to. I think, and not least because of what has happened in the intervening period, right? That especially that Victorian literary studies has been shaped so much in that time by the kind of undisciplining response to. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but to the murder of George Floyd and to the and other related issues, but yeah, I think and I hope that kind of that there has been more a kind of a theoretical relationship to correspondence and to historicism that has changed kind of as an add-on effect to kind of what Rebecca was talking about yesterday with Victorianists and Romanticists paying more attention to critical race theory, and so, you know, like, you can't look at letters the same way after reading Saidiya Hartman, right, as after reading the V21 manifesto or something like that. Like, I personally have never thought the tension that they identified made any sense at all. For me, like, I think it's a non-tension, but I think that as our discipline has kind of morphed into something that is more especially conscious of race and not just empire, that kind of concomitant questions about historicism have followed. I hope, I think, certainly that's how it feels to me.
Question in the chat from Sarah Haslam. She says, "This was a great panel. Thank you all. My question is for Matthew. I wonder if you could offer a view on what material good our scholarship can create, given the context of dirty knowledge as you summarized them today."
Yeah. So the short answer is read Julia Schleck's book. Not least because it's blessedly short. It's like 120 pages, and it's really precise and provocative. But what she talks about is kind of the ideas of the kind of concept of academic freedom as it was institutionalized by the AAUP in this country in 1915 was really based on these liberal ideas about disinterested knowledge in the service of the public good and the state. It just as a sidebar, it was really striking to me in writing this paper how much that language from the AAUP in 1915 kind of paralleled the language of what Philip Cunliffe and the second director of the South Kensington Museum was talking about, the kind of missions of knowledge institutions. But so what I took away from Schleck's book is that the idea of kind of a monolithic public good has evaporated in an environment where malefactors like the Koch Foundation can come in and tip the scales with a lot of money and their vision of what the public good is. And so, but rather than to kind of disassemble that monolithic sense of the public good into the individual goods that we each like. We all think that what we do contributes good to the world, right? I hope so. Like otherwise, I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. But and it's fine that it's fine that that vision of the good doesn't make any sense to a sociologist or something like that, because we have competing interests. We have competing senses of what the good of our disciplines are doing. So I think that kind of the making that sense of the public good based on our disciplinary practices and having it being contending amongst different disciplines, not least the ones that it's not that the Koch Foundation is going to go away. Like we need to contest that vision of the public good that seeps into research. And I think really. What I found most refreshing, and I'll shut up after this, is that sense of that vision of historical knowledge as dirty, as messy, as implicated in as our practices being implicated in systems of power. That Schleck links that to being able to rethink academic freedom, and that was just like, right. So that would be my rambling concern.
Next question, please.
Well, thank you to all of you. I have a question for Martha. I was really struck by your point that some of these patronesses, you were saying it's not just a metropole to a colony relationship, but a periphery to a periphery. So if I can make my question make sense, I'm wondering if there was, because it was a periphery to a periphery, I'm taking your word for that. That sounds compelling. That sounds true, right? Do you see that there's a sense of trying to differentiate the two peripheries, to put one above the other? Does that lead to in your sense, a greater alliance between these patronesses and the communities that they're supporting, or something else completely, if that question makes sense?
It does, thank you. I think and this is probably because of the kinds of spaces in Empire I'm studying. It would be quite different if they were for consular wives in the Caribbean, for example, I would think. But there seems to be a real eagerness to identify similarity, I think in part to know that this project of settlement is working, but also to know that the strategy they have to offer that they know so well from their own estates back home might work and might actually be something. They manage rural nursing associations in the Highlands and Islands in Scotland and rural Wales, and sometimes it's over quite a lot of the county. And so I think there's this familiarity and this belief that maybe we could translate the same thing to solve the same problem, because at Foundation, the medical issues are often the same. And the big one is childbirth. And we need to get nurses who are trained in midwifery out to people who can't travel to a hospital. Where it starts to kind of fall apart is when we're dealing with venomous bites in Australia, and British women who don't necessarily have any familiarity with that because the nurses themselves are also trained British nurses and midwives. So over the history of the association, usually they start employing local women and realizing that that's a much more effective strategy, lower status, less thoroughly trained local women, because they're more familiar with sort of the perils of rural living in a specific context. But I don't necessarily see a privileging of, rural Scotland's problems over, rural Newfoundland's problems. Probably in some of the classed and sometimes race language describing the patients, I can kind of start seeing it entering in there. But keep in mind, for example, women who are running estates in Ireland might not necessarily be Irish themselves, right? And so sometimes talking about their own tenants and neighbors, it's quite similar, if that makes sense.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
See a lot of, similarities between like Indian folks.
I would love to hear all of you kind of speak on something that Danae's presentation provoked for me, which is this idea of like how letters inform our interpretation, whether that's literary interpretation or historical interpretation. And in part, this comes from I would describe myself for years. I would always say, oh, I don't use archives. And I never knew quite whether that was like a bad or a good thing that I did. The last few years, I've like tried to, but as I've sort of made a conscious effort to say, okay, I want to use archives, the question mark in my mind was always why? Because for so long, I never did, right? So like, what difference is it going to make to my reading of novels, for example, to bring in the archives? And it seemed like all of y'all were kind of thinking about that. Like, how does your reading of correspondence then affect the way you're reading and interpreting these texts that are being authored? So I would love to just kind of hear your experience on that.
Sure, thanks. I'll maybe start us off. I think in my case, bringing correspondence into the equation as a methodology and as a way of allowing some kind of like self-reflexivity around the reading practices as a scholar, essentially multiplies the lenses to which I would bring to a literary text, because in the case of a letter, I'm very aware of the specific rhetorical context, aware of how much of the rhetorical context may be missing for me. And so it had for me like a kind of kaleidoscopic effect, where part of my interest in Kenyon's letters on a drama of exile were because that almost collaborative partnership that they enjoyed was in tension with some of the ways in which Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Elizabeth Barrett EBB would speak about her poetic practices in terms of like being seized on a subject or having something come into her head like a hurricane, to then be able to juxtapose that one way of narrating the creative process with what another letter might reveal. In the case of Olive Schreiner, who is also important for my larger project and whose correspondence has been preserved thanks to a really great digital project, I found it interesting to juxtapose letters in which she would be writing to someone like Havelock Ellis, talking about how she's using the Bible for the devil's own purposes, kind of playfully, like self-reflexively calling attention to that sort of rebellious energy. But other letters, in fact, even though she was quite an outspoken free thinker, she had a really meaningful epistolary exchange with a Presbyterian minister named John T. Lloyd, who was a minister and yet really admired her free thinking work. And some of those letters are where I feel like she gets into almost a bit of a manifesto for what she's doing with the form of the parable. So being able to see those tensions and to sort of realize that sometimes, it's not a matter of, having a sort of a linear progression of like loss of faith or return to faith, in terms of questions from a post-secular lens. So just productive fragmentation would be how I describe it.
I'm not very good on this question because I honestly, in none of my training was I taught to look at a letter as a piece of literature or to read in that way, because I have a very traditional historical training at Princeton. It's a very old school training. I mean, I don't know other folks in other programs in other parts of the country. I don't want to speak for the whole profession. Maybe you're getting a sort of more progressive way, but I found this very interesting, and I think I maybe would have done that more had I been studying famous authors And that would have been something that would have occurred to me more naturally to see similarities, because we do read novels, see similarities are interesting. But, you know, it's not something that would have occurred. I've looked at some of, Schreiner was on the committee of one of the associations I study, and I'm looking at that letter to see if she mentions her charitable work. You know, I'm not looking at it to see the language she's using to do that. An exception would be, you know, I am interested in the language used to describe these seemingly disparate rural spaces. And so at times I thought, wow, I wish I had more training in understanding what they're doing, because I think they're doing something interesting, but I can't really articulate it. So this is why I need to attend events like this.
I'm still like trying to figure out what I'm thinking here, but as far as thinking about letters and form, a couple of things come to mind, and I'm gonna boldly extrapolate from what I've seen in the Browning's correspondence to what I think is true of a lot of Victorian authors or correspondence. One is the Brownings are very repetitive in their letters. So they will say, they'll describe an issue that they're working through in one of their works to one person. And then in another letter of the same day or next day, they'll describe the same issue, but you know, it's always a little different. So being able to say, okay, EBB is struggling with rhyming in this one section of her poem, and how she would talk to, say, Kenyon about it might differ from the way that she was talking to Browning about it. So being able to take the multiple perspectives that the correspondence offers, especially when you have so much correspondence, and to really get multiple angles on how this poem was formed is really, really cool. Thinking about the form of the letter, the form of the poem. The letters kind of just form like a constellation where you can see so much more happening in the poetic craft. And then but I'm also thinking of content-wise, it's really fun to see how EBB would talk to different scholars or friends. So she would talk to, say, there was this Greek scholar that she was very good friends with early on, and they went back and forth debating Greek pronunciations. So letters, there'd be letters where she would just be like, I think if you just kind of go with the organic sound of the Greek, the way that it naturally comes out is the way it's supposed to be pronounced. And then they would go back and forth theoretically. But thinking about, you can kind of see how those theories of what Greek ought to be kind of shape her ideas of what English poetry ought to be. Not necessarily one-to-one, but that theory is informing that. But then to another person, she might talk about the content and the issues, not so much the sounds or the rhymes. So the correspondence has a lot to offer when it comes to poetic craft. I would think that's true of novelists too, but my observations is mostly restricted to the Brownings.
I can do the novelists. That's a good, or like at least George Eliot would. But no, I think one of the reasons, and this goes back to a little bit the question of genre, goes back a little bit to my unsatisfying answer earlier to Jennifer's question, but I think that or maybe I'll get there, Jennifer. But is that I think one of the reasons why correspondence interests me so much is similar to the reason that Victorian periodicals interest me so much, which is that they're doing, in fact, what realism tries to represent, right? That it's that it is precisely in those perspectival shifts that you all were talking about that is kind of marshaled into a larger narrative apparatus. And I think that the value of that in reading correspondence is similar to that of reading a realist novel, whereas that those shifts in dialogue between ideas kind of expose those discursive fictions that of separate spheres and you know and other things that just, you know, there are the ideology of the Victorian period that then you read letters and you're like, oh, like we were talking yesterday about men and women corresponding among each other, and it just kind of explodes this ideological fiction. And I think the where I do kind of going back to tensions in methodology in the field, I do still think that there is tension between kind of formalism or like formalist criticism and historicism that is I think kind of productively unresolved in Victorian studies. Like I don't think we should necessarily resolve that, but I think that thinking of letters as a literary genre, as Rosemary Bodenheimer and others teach us to do, really shows how that tension can maybe kind of resolve that it is fiction, and again there's the rationale, there's the good of reading and teaching fiction is that that those skills are helpful for understanding the real factual historical things as well.
And we had another question over there.
Yes, picking up from what you said about this, maybe because I'm not a Victorianist, can you trust letters, even familiar letters? Because in the 18th century, correspondence knew that they could be intercepted. We talked a little bit about they get lost, or because they go to another country, God knows what happens to them. But we know that even familiar letters were read by other people and were read aloud. So as an 18th century person, I never trust a letter as a document of what you said, this overlap between realist with realist novel. I would go like, oh no, because it's about performance. So we can talk about the form. Yes, it goes into the, I guess, into the early, what I would call the early novel, and then into the realist novel. But it's also about the language chosen and the selection of content. So we talked about censorship earlier, Matt. You were saying, oh my God, you have to take stuff out, which in the 18th century, people just cut stuff out. No big deal. That's just what you did. But also there was a self-censorship. And even in familiar letters, which I've looked at between sisters, you can feel that there is a holding back because the parents could have read the letters or someone else, right? And then there's even one instance where one sister says, well, I know that my mum will read this, I'm therefore writing it in French. Right? So the question to you is, how much can you actually trust the letters as historical documents or even literary documents? Because it's about performance and self-fashioning.
I have a really quick answer just to get out of the way, which is that I don't trust Robert Lytton at all. He was the Viceroy of India, for God's sake. But I think that that's one of the, and it goes to kind of the question of genre a little bit, because I started reading those exchanges less as personal correspondence and more along the lines of colonial administration, as you know what I mean, that was I read that as being those kind of instincts that Lytton was, who was a career diplomat. He was in Vienna, then he was in India, then he was in France, and he died on the job in France. But so I tend to read it at less, well, I don't know about less self-fashion. I'm much less adept or knowledgeable about the records of administration of the empire, for example, but that's kind of more the genre I read.
Maybe just to add that I think sort of some of the delight was in seeing the same event. And Allie, you talked about this as well in terms of with the Brownings, and I think you can extrapolate that. One of the values I found of reading letters was like treating them as a kind of fiction, especially in places where you have an archive that allows you to see multiple renditions of the same story told different ways. And so then what you end up with is, I think, something where you're aware that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And because the two different parts may be asymmetrical and equal, they have a value that is not, the same quite as saying like, oh, okay, I'm taking this for fact, but I'm saying, okay, this is one representation. How can I productively think about it in context. And I think one of the great things for me, having the privilege of working here at the Armstrong Browning Library, is that I was able to sort of hold together letters and autographed manuscripts and books. And so there's this sense of trying to contextualize the letters within a broader archive that includes correspondence as well as many other forms.
The question, I think it depends on what you're trusting the letters to do, right? I think the self-fashioning is really interesting. And, you know, one of the families I study, it's a mother and then her 4 daughters, and there's the letters to each other, and then the letters about mom, and then the letters to mom. And I think reading them in some is interesting. But I also think this is where collaboration with archivists and librarians to figure out how the collection came together can be really interesting, because I read it differently if I know the woman put it there herself versus poor Mary Curzon, whose husband claimed that he had like really stringently edited the collection, and it has very personal information about her cycle, about her emotions. I mean, it's quite personal, about her miscarriages and things that you know, I think when I first went into an aristocratic archive and there were 2,000 files for the husband and 2 for the wife, I assumed sexism, they don't appreciate her contributions. And then I realized she outlived him by 40 years, and that's probably what she wanted to keep. And so I read it totally differently. But that information can be hard to come by, and collections don't always know. So again, there's a gap there, but when you can figure it out, I think it's really interesting to know why it's there and who put it there. But again, I think I trust it to the extent that, you know, it depends on what I'm trusting it to do for me. To, you know, trust it to tell me what someone's, you know, bare authentic soul is. I don't know that there's a source that I would trust, because these women wrote their journals to be published, and I would have thought previously that those were quite private and more private than correspondence, but they were written for publication. But for example, Mary Curzon, you know, writes to in a letter to her parents, she says, they suggest that maybe they're very interesting, maybe you should publish them. And she says, no, I consider these totally private and I expect you to destroy them. And so I do read her letters a little bit differently, just with that expectation of privacy that I do think she had, that her husband did not honor.
And I think this is going to be the last question. We're running out of time. I know our next activity is at 10:30. Getting close. So
Okay.
go ahead.
I'll try to limit my comment then. I love this discussion about correspondences, especially correspondences as dialogues. So maybe building off of Allie's comments, you can see that the dialogue almost in real time because you're reading it as the recipient would have read it. Have any of y'all, questions open to the whole panel, read a set of correspondences as a dialogue working towards a greater idea or work, and then read the product of that finished work, a book or a poem or a novel? And has that, in light of the correspondence, does that shed more light on the finished work?
I could start us off. With the Brownings, it can be very satisfying because you can have both sides of the dialogue a lot of times. And you can usually connect it directly to their works, and that can be very satisfying. And I have done that. One thing I've been thinking about this conference, I don't think we've talked about it yet, but sort of the disjunctive experience of reading correspondence online. So I noticed a lot of scholars have been referencing like the published correspondence, which I weirdly, because the Browning correspondence is all online, I've almost always read it online, which can be great because it's searchable, but also can be really bad because it can lead to you having a lot of blind spots. So for example, if I was researching the Browning's discussions of Homer, and I just type in Homer, and I get a million results, and I start filtering through, I'm not flipping through their correspondence in the order that it came with the back and forth. And of course, with a lot of published correspondence, you don't have that back and forth. You have one side, which is hard too. But I think having it online is so much more accessible, but it's far easier to be lazy and not see the full picture. So even my story of the Brownings back and forth, I almost missed because I was doing that search method. So I didn't realize, hey, this is a thread that carries on across multiple letters. And it took me time to realize that. Whereas if I were doing the slow method of just reading through the correspondence, I would not have missed that story arc. which I think that's been my biggest pitfall as a person trying to bring correspondence into scholarship. Is to get really myopic and just focused on keywords that may or may not be picking up the story.
All right, one more hair band.